Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Today's webinar is about when good people do bad things. This is one in a series of webinars where we connect for about 30 minutes to bring to life some of the challenges we see in the market today. Pamela Metzen, Managing Partner for North America at Axialent, together with our guest speaker, David Gebler, will dig into how ethics and values are critical in today's corporate world. Feel free to enter any of your questions that you might have in the question function on your control panel, and we have reserved about 30 minutes at the end of the call to talk about some of your questions. And with that, I hand it off to you, Pamela.
Thank you, Barbie. Welcome, everyone. Very pleased to have you here, David. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much.
I'm fascinated about this topic because I think that it underlines so much of what we talk about when we talk about the difference between someone's intention and their actual impact and the importance of this conversation and some of the counterintuitive things that happen with the complexities of being human. So excited to have you here. I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll be right here beside you to create a little dialogue. And like Barbie said, there'll be time for questions afterwards. So take it away, David.
Great. Thank you very much, Pamela. And I'm thrilled to have this conversation because I've seen over my 20-plus years working, starting in the area of corporate compliance and business ethics, and then moving into understanding more about conscious business in the past 5 years, how there's such a deep interrelationship and weaving of some of the areas of which corporate compliance and ethics are just one of them. It's often a false notion that in business ethics world, we often will not differentiate between a good person and a bad person doing a bad thing. For me, a bad person doing a bad thing, that's fraud. That's a criminal action. We don't really have to spend a lot of time on digging deep in terms of that person's motivations. But what does happen, though, which is of vital importance for everybody in organizations, is if there's a bad apple, they usually don't act alone. And so what happens when the rest of the people in the organization are not speaking up, not taking action, not doing something to isolate this bad actor? It's kind of like a healthy immune system in terms of antibodies. And a healthy organization is one in which there's always going to be some bad actors, but how quickly does the organization wrap around and isolate and get rid of the kind of the bad actors? Similarly, what happens is that most ethics scandals, the ones that have been in the news over the past 20 years, from Enron and MCI up through the recent Volkswagen scandal, most of the time they don't start with bad people doing bad things. They start with good people who are under tremendous pressure. And we are looking at, well, how do people respond to pressure? How do people respond to the dynamic that they're facing? And so that's a lot of the framework here, is to really become aware of what kind of pressures we're acting under ourselves, and then how do we actually take some control over our own actions. And that's where, again, it's such a wonderful interplay with some of the core mental models and mindsets that we've been working with in conscious business. So let's dive in, and we'll do a little bit of a test. And as I go through this, we're not going to have a chance to do too much interactivity here. I just want you to be thinking about what your gut response is and where does it lead your thinking. So take $10. Not a lot of money. Right now it's probably worth about $10. So imagine it's late afternoon, you need a bit of a boost of energy, and you go to your favorite little coffee shop diner just outside of work down the block. And you go there often, and you get your usual $8 latte that you get every day, and you drink your latte, you're ready to go back to work, the server gives you the bill, and for $8 you give her a $10 bill, and she gives you $12 and change. So for those on the call who are perhaps mathematically challenged, you got $10 extra back. What do? Do you give the money back to the server? Now, if you are like most people, the answer is an automatic, of course I do. But I want you to parse through your response, why? Yes, you're probably saying to yourself, well, it's the right thing to do. The money doesn't belong to me. I was raised to be honest. And then you're also thinking, well, I was a server myself, whether it was in college or one of my first jobs. And I know that for most servers, if the cash drawer is off at the end of the day, it's going to come out of their own pocket. So I see a face. I know exactly what the consequences are of my not returning the money. And some people always said, well, just good karma. If I give the money back, something good will come back to me. All valid reasons. And it's all interwoven with our sense of it's the right thing to do. But what about a different circumstance? Imagine for a second, just in your mind's eye, your favorite utility, your favorite telephone company, the cell phone carrier that you love, and they love you because you are a valued customer of theirs. Imagine for a second that on the rare occasion where you actually look at your bill, you get a $10 error in your favor. Just like when we played Monopoly as kids, a bank error in your favor, $10 in your favor. What do? Do you return the $10 to the phone company? Let's just think about that for a second. Do you return the $10? Now, if you're like most people who I've gone through this exercise with, the vast majority of people say, no, I don't return the $10. A few people say yes, but most people don't. And when I ask them why, we tend to have the same category of answers. Well, it's going to take too long. You know how much time? It's not worth my time to return the $10. I mean, for goodness sake, the $10 to the large company, it's meaningless to them. And besides the fact, they've overcharged me for so many years. Anyways, this is like a little bit of my comeuppance. And I actually, you know what? It's not even their money. It's my money, and I'm getting it back. And so what happens is that lost in the conversation about our rationalization of why it's perfectly okay to not give the money back is the fact that, hey, it doesn't belong to us. And so what happens is that even though we have this core value of honesty and we've been inculcated with that since we were a child, it's so easy to be able to lose that in the context of rationalization. And in a group setting where you have people reinforcing that, the vast majority of people would not give the money back. But Pamela, I know that you probably, I don't know, what would you do?
Well, I mean, I resonate. I mean, so to be perfectly transparent, I would have some feelings about it, but I have had situations where I've gotten ridiculous charges. So the act of very quick, and this is milliseconds, of rationalization and justification, I can just see how human that is.
Yeah, we all do it. We all do it. And so that's part of that calculation that we have to make, is that being honest is not something that is locked in so hardwired that you don't have to, it's challenged continuously. And so we need to create kind of paradigms for ourselves to figure out that it's not a question of always being honest or dishonest, but what do you choose to do? Because we're confronted with it just all the time. I find it fascinating over the years since, really since 9/11, about turning off cell phones. And the question is, do people turn them off or not? Before they changed the rules recently, people would say, well, it's ridiculous. I know that cell phones don't bring down airplanes, so therefore it's just a bureaucratic rule, and I'm going to choose whether I'm going to follow it or not. So each of us has a very flexible relationship between rules and ethics. And even though there are certain rules we will always follow because we're honest and law-abiding, we also can, again, do the same exercise of rationalization to say there are other certain rules that I don't follow. And inside an organization, those who are propagating the rules, corporate compliance, legal department, need to be mindful that people are people, and if we're human outside of work, we're likely to be human inside of work, well, at least the vast majority. And that means that people are going to have this very challenged relationship with the rules no matter what. I find it interesting when I do a lot of travel, and I'll ask each of the listeners to think about it for themselves as well. Certain cities, it's perfectly acceptable, if not mandatory, to jaywalk, and in other cities, it's not. Now, what happens when you go to a city you've never been to before, and you're going to engage in your usual behavior of jaywalking? What do you catch yourself doing? And it's interesting, if you're like me, of course I'm going to look to see if it's safe to cross. And let's assume it's safe to cross in terms of just no cars coming. But I also look to the person to my left and right to see what's the social norm in this environment. And even though I've made my own independent sole actor decision about the rules, I also will make my own calculation based upon social norms. And so again, what I find to be fascinating and underdeveloped is that our decision about our own independent actions are heavily influenced by the social norms around us. I like to look at it this way, that we may like to think that our behavior is just 100% determined by the values given to us by our family, by our community, by our religious institutions, and that our behavior is predictable based upon those values in which we've been imbued with since we were a small child. But culture has a tremendous role with regards to the same dynamic. Now, culture could be our societal culture in terms of the country, region you live in. It could be the culture in your local community. If we're talking about work, it's the culture within the organization, and that's broken down into subcultures. It may be the corporation, it could be the division, it could also be the culture in my floor and within my small team. And there's a relationship between both of them. Now, on the one hand, there are instances where behavior definitively impacts culture. That's certainly easiest to see when you have a very charismatic leader and he or she is the kind of a person positively and sometimes negatively can actually create a certain dynamic in the culture, for sure. But it's also true the other way as well, that even though I may be a person who is normally, let's say, positive spirited and I'm always the enthusiastic, if I'm in a culture, kind of the Debbie Downer culture, where because of the pressure, people start to do a little bit of backstabbing, and there's a lot of pressure on my behavior is going to change. And so even though I like to think of myself as being this complete independent actor, it's not the case. And that I am and I will react to the culture that surrounds me. And so part of the key, I think, self-awareness that we each need to be thinking about is that we're not islands and that we are certainly impacted by the culture around us.
I'm struck as you speak, David, that while some of that happens by the jaywalking example of looking around and seeing what's normed in terms of behavioral norms, especially for leaders, so people in power within the organization, a lot of this happens quite unconsciously as well.
Yeah, definitively. And I think that's also part of our framework here. So I like to, I think it helps to start to categorize what some of these factors are. Oftentimes, the behavior impacting culture is a form of self-deception, of which there's just so much written about and studied today in terms of us not even being aware. I've worked with so many leaders that they don't recognize that they themselves are their own worst enemy. They're honest people. You can trust them on a personal level. They have high levels of personal integrity, but they don't realize that they're actually creating negative culture that's going to impact others. And then what happens going back the other way is we rationalize. We are human. We rationalize that this action may be okay or needed. The ends justify the means. And then conformity is another painful human foible that we all engage in, and that even if we know it's wrong, we often will conform. And you're right. I think a lot of it is so deep in our psyche and in our just neurological makeup that if we don't acknowledge that, it's really going to be hard to change it, right? We react to threats. So that impulse is going to hit us, and that's normal, and that's just human nature. The part that we have to be able to, I always like to say, just give ourselves a half-second pause to be able to acknowledge that we are acting human, and therefore I have to make a choice as to, am I going to actively suppress what is a normal response, as opposed to pretending that I'm above and beyond the normal human responses that we're all vulnerable to.
Exactly. And we as human beings are so hardwired to belong. You know, it comes on Maslow's hierarchy even before self-esteem, where those even perceived or even committed values would be held, the needs of, the threat may be not only fitting in, but fitting in and adapting to this culture so that I can pay my mortgage and take care of my family. So those are real threats, but even they're held unconsciously.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true. We hate to be standing out from the crowd. In certain cultures, it's so dominant, right? You just don't do that. Classically, you see this in a lot of aspects of both Japanese culture and Australian culture, right? It's just not socially accepted for positive reasons or negative reasons. You don't want to stick your neck out, and and so even in cultures like the American culture, where I'm based, where we think of ourselves as rugged individualists, we still don't like to stick our necks out and be differentiated from the crowd. And so we have to start to acknowledge that for sure. So there's been a lot of work lately, and I think it's fascinating to just see how all these threads come through. And it doesn't relate just to business ethics and good people doing bad things. So much work is being done now with unconscious bias, and just an acknowledgement that we don't have to punish ourselves for being human. We just have to work on understanding that this unconscious bias exists, and therefore we have the ability to acknowledge it. And if we're open and in a place where we can have these conversations, you can start to acknowledge it.
Exactly. I was reading some research in preparation for this webinar, David, and I'm getting excited about your presentation. And one of the most recent studies in the neuroscience of unconscious bias is around literally the hormonal response to perceived power or lack thereof. So even within the unconscious bias conversation, the fact this is a physiological experience as well as a cognitive experience.
Yeah, yeah. And then related to that, when I've done work with blind spots, and there's some wonderful research being done out of the Harvard Business School, Max Bazerman, talking about blind spots as it relates to business ethics. It's really looking at, again, this hardwired concept of different dimensions of self-deception in terms of confirmation bias, where we see it ourselves. If you ever have gone to a casino, like the whole concept of doubling down, like there's no logic to it, but we always feel like we have the ability, if things are going bad, to just double down and it'll all be better. So in the workplace, it creates a lot of problems when we just refuse to believe that things are not going well, and so therefore early warning signs are ignored, and that will be often, if you do a root cause analysis of trouble, where that stems from.
And equally so confusing your intention with the impact that you're creating.
Yes, yes, and part of it is what I've seen, and this relates both to the breadth of diversity work as well as from my work in business ethics, is the hesitancy to acknowledge that. That I find really fascinating. That as we start to see all this research coming out about unconscious bias, and that lo and behold, we are human, there's a bit of a notion, I think, I'd love to get your thoughts, Pamela, about how it's uncomfortable to talk about it. And so I know that some of the more cutting edge research, for example, on unconscious bias as relates to race, is in around the fact that if we can acknowledge that there are these kind of inherent racial biases, if you can acknowledge it, then you can work with it, as opposed to being in denial about that.
100% agree. I think that the stretch that often happens with great intentions is that we move from seeing that there's an issue to, okay, there's no issue and these are the ways we're fixing it, instead of actually let's have a dialogue and acknowledge that as human beings it's natural for us to have bias, and it's so shaped and so embedded that the dialogue around it and the acknowledgement of it is really the first step in addressing it openly.
Yeah, yeah. So, a couple things that struck me in thinking about business ethics and corporate scandals and bad things, and related back to some of this work, is how there are some patterns that exist that, because the line hasn't been crossed yet, are often not fully articulated. What I mean by that is many ethics scandals, and I'm going to talk about a couple in a second, start from organizations that are so incredibly homogeneous in terms of just not just ethnic and racial background, gender, but also in terms of just mindsets, that it feeds on each other. There isn't enough diversity in the room to be able to have conversations that challenge assumptions. And so what happens is that leadership teams that are made up of individuals from exactly the same life experiences are almost adding risk from the very beginning, because they are going to be reaffirming and confirming assumptions without challenging them, because they're coming from their own life experience. So one of the most wonderful applications of diversity that I've seen is not just in diversity as it relates to meeting legal requirements in terms of affirmative action or equal opportunity, but in terms of diversity of actually creating a dynamic where, of course, I'm going to speak up, because that point of view doesn't make any sense. And
Yeah.
enlightened leaders are the ones who I think can understand that from the get-go as they even start.
That's part of the critical piece that I'm sure that you're moving toward, is this unidentifying with our ideas, so that we can see that the challenge is a gift, and challenge is part of leveraging the power of our team rather than a personal attack or that someone's against me.
Yeah, definitively. And so what happens is, if you look at some of the root causes of some of the scandals, for example, that we're facing. So you can take Volkswagen as one example, and we don't have time to go into all of the minutia of it, but the main headline of the scandal is that for a long time, well over 10, maybe 12 years, Volkswagen knew that there was no way they were going to be able to meet the emission standards for diesel in North America and actually in Europe and have the high-performing cars that people want to buy. And if you think back, I don't know, I was doing car shopping 10 years ago, and I always thought it was strange, and now I kind of smile at it. Why is it that Volkswagen is the only car out there that's selling turbo diesels in the US? And I asked questions, and people said, well, nobody else can meet the environmental standards. And at the time, everybody's reaction was, wow, they must be doing something right. And as it turned out, they were doing something fraudulent. So what happened? So the thing about it from this conversation is that we'll make the assumption that nobody at Volkswagen started off as a crook, but it was a ruthless culture. It was a culture based upon one of vested control in a very small group. Because the government, the local regional government, is a shareholder in Volkswagen, it was almost like a fiefdom from a time past in terms of the level of control, and therefore a lot of micromanagement, a lot of fear-based decision-making, and you did not want to question authority, maybe a vestige of other aspects of culture. And so what happened is that as pressure mounted, and this is true of any large organization, ideas come up, and some of these ideas are just bad ideas. That's just normal. In fact, it's probably healthy for innovation to have bad ideas. But the question is, what do you do about it? And at Volkswagen, it was really a case where nobody spoke up. They were fearful of speaking up. And it basically came only when it literally, all the stuff hit the fan, did all this come out. But if you start doing your root cause analysis, so much of it was based upon a culture where speaking up was just not permitted. And so one of the things that I always emphasize about ethics when I'm speaking with leaders is a reminder this is not about morals. And ethics is not about even understanding that we should do the right thing. Everybody wants to do the right thing. That's not a question. The question is, in spite of the fact that everybody wants to do the right thing and they don't, what are we going to do about it? And so for leaders, the critical dynamic here is being just open and honest about our own vulnerabilities as people. We're not pointing fingers at my vulnerability as an individual. We're vulnerable as leaders. And so if we can have leaders understand that we are all vulnerable and managers are just as vulnerable to pressure as anybody else, that half-second pause before we speak, before we act, can do a lot. as well as a recognition that business ethics is about responsibility to create the environment that reduces the odds of bad stuff happening to begin with. It's really understanding, if you're in a situation like Volkswagen, of having enough awareness to recognize that, wow, we really don't speak up, do we? This may be a ticking time bomb. We need to be able to be aware of that. So ethical leaders, as opposed to ethical people, ethical leaders are those individuals that are aware of how their actions impact others, and they're aware of what needs to happen in order for their actions to, for the culture to not create the situation where it's just inevitable that bad things are going to happen.
And just speaking to that self-awareness about own vulnerabilities, that can be applied to the culture and the entire organization itself as well. One of the most recent culture programs that we did, and David, you and I did this together, a part of their culture rollout to ensure that this was not simply an internal marketing campaign about our values, a big part of it was asking the questions that said, where would we be challenged in our day-to-day course of rhythm of business? Where would we be challenged in this value? Where would it be hard? Where would there be competing commitments that we need to attend to and create systems and processes to ensure that we don't cross that line?
Yeah, and I think it's just fantastic that that level of awareness and to be able to ask those questions ahead of time is really powerful, because that's proof to me that a leader is showing the ability to look a little further down the road than just the immediate quarter or the immediate tasks in front of them. So we can use some of the tools that we're really comfortable with. I mean, part of it is just as acknowledgement that, as we've talked about in other contexts, that the volatility and uncertainty of the world these days, and then bringing it back to, it'd be nice to just talk about a VUCA business world, but I think it's the VUCA world is definitive for everything. If this is our reality, then the ability to allow people to express their fears, to be able to have a safe place to raise issues and to ask questions is just vital. And it's vital not just to protect an organization against ethical risk, but just vital in order to be sustainable. And the only way to do that is to acknowledge that there are a lot of human survival factors that perhaps would otherwise allow us to put our heads in the sand, and we need to be able to fight that and push that through.
Exactly, I'm referencing back to the amygdala hijack, and the way we're hardwired. Just the acknowledgement that with this VUCA world, and I agree with you, it's the world, not simply organizations or the business world, that we're under chronic stress, so our need to attend to these vulnerabilities is even greater.
Yeah. So, we've got tool sets to help us with that. I mean, I think one of the things that I find really powerful, amongst other dynamics of finding balance, is in the notion that our focus on achievement is real, legitimate, and critical, but the pause that can take place of understanding both my role in terms of where I'm vulnerable as an individual, and then understanding human nature as it impacts conformity and the tremendous pressure that we want to not be against the grain. If we can start to weave in a little bit of the I and the we, it really serves as a wonderful break before decisions just are rolling out of control. And so I find that balance to be really powerful. And similarly, one of the other tools that I find to be incredibly helpful in helping leaders walk through the tough choices is to help them see that these choices are not binary. One of the things that always comes up, and it's just fascinating when you do kind of a root cause analysis of why, a lot of times when an organization will come to me, for example, and they're basically scratching their heads thinking, how could they have done this? Like, what were they thinking? And the actions were, oftentimes the manager would say, well, this was the only way I could achieve my objective and do what the company asked me to do. And so they put on the notion of unethical conduct as being a binary. You either, you know, do what you need to do or not, and there isn't an opportunity to actually break down the decision making in terms of its nuances. I mean, there are, in meeting an objective, tough objectives, there are things that will allow us to do it effectively, and there's things that will allow us um, to create problems. And so if we can start to break down what we think we're hearing is our mission from a leader that would lead us to, in other circumstances, to take some unethical action, just by actually breaking down the thinking in terms of it being a tension between how do I maybe push an envelope but not cross it, or whatever mixed metaphor that is about crossing a line versus meeting my objectives. Often by just being able to articulate the framework, you can, again, slow down the process to allow a different viewpoint to come in and protect yourself and the organization from some bad actions.
Great, two fabulous tools. So David, I want to say thank you so much. We'll move to questions now. So Barbie, any questions from the audience?
Yes, I do. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, what do I do if my boss insists if I don't do something and I'm at risk of losing my job?
Um, so that's a really common question. And what I often find is the reality is that that's the way that in a high emotional state, the person will reflect back the question. Um, but what's very interesting is in the vast, vast majority of cases, that really isn't even the way that the manager has expressed the issue. It really is the classic application of a ladder of inference, meaning that we think we're hearing something and therefore we make this potentially binary choice of either I do this or I lose my job, when in fact that really might not even be what the boss intended. And maybe the boss could have done a better job of articulating his or her own fear in a way that didn't make it seem like it was a binary choice. But in many times that's not actually the question. But even if you feel that it is the question, that I'm being put in this situation, again, using like a tool like a polarity map can really help. Like before you act, what are the other options that are available? Is it really true that you're going to lose your job? And at some point you may have to decide, well, I have control over that. You know, I'm not going to be forced into doing something that's unethical. Who are you asking questions of? Is there really nobody you can speak to at a peer level, or even the person, him or herself, an ethics officer? It's really rare that somebody is completely isolated and they're alone and they have to make that tough decision in the field if they're going to do something wrong or lose their job. So I would respond back to that, and maybe an opportunity to reframe the question before you're actually confronted with that very difficult binary choice.
I love where you're pointing, David, the use of the ladder of inference and just realizing that some assumptions could be made, but the power of, like you said, the reflecting back to the manager might provide a moment of pause for the manager that, you know, in that VUCA environment with high pressures on them as well, that helping them think through, is this really what we want to do? And here are the trade-offs and here are my concerns, can be an effective way to partner with your manager.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really looking at the process and not rushing to kind of even, I mean, even as a victim kind of framework, I have no choice. This is the only thing I can do. And it just is never, it's just never, it's so rare that it's actually that kind of fostering a choice.
Great. Thank you, David.
And David, this might be related, but what if you're being incented to perform and kind of feel at odds on what to do? Would you say it's kind of similar?
Yeah, you know, it is interesting. It's more nuanced, right? And it's fascinating because this is also a place where a lot of people who get into trouble um, will use this as their rationalization. Right? There are many instances where the incentive structures are either outdated or they're misguided. And it is true that many times people feel like it's the corollary to my boss told me to do it. It's now more subtle. Well, this is what I'm incented to do. So therefore, if I'm incented to do it, it must be that the organization feels that this is really the right thing to do. So I'm actually just doing what the organization is telling me to do. And if you listen to yourself, you're still rationalizing that even with a misguided incentive system, are they really asking you to engage in misconduct, something that's either illegal, unethical, or against the policy? And so you're really not in a fundamentally different place. It's the decisions may be a little bit more difficult, and you may have a little bit more human nature that you need to consciously acknowledge and overcome. But it's still the same aspect of it's still your choice. And if you feel like the only way you're going to be successful in this business is to actually run the risk of personal trouble, then you really have to ask whether this is the place you want to be working. But less drastic is asking some tough questions. And in many instances, I've seen that these are not even intended, and that what happens is that it's just kind of a perfect storm of incentives and situations, and oftentimes leaders are grateful that somebody has really kind of brought this to attention so they can actually confront it, because again, there are leaders who don't want to raise the issues, and so you can always work it back up the system to do the right thing if you really want to.
And I love that question from an individual level and helicoptering up to the organizational level. It just points to that great idiom that there's always function and dysfunction. There's a reason why human beings do what they do. So as an organization can look very proactively at where our incentives, incentivizing the very behavior that we're trying to shift, or behavior that's counter to our values and what we say we're committed to.
Yeah. Agreed.
I have another
Agreed.
question. How do I create this kind of culture in my organization?
Magic beans. In fact, good question, because we can sell them to you. So I think that there's ways to do it you got to start in small steps. One of the things that I always cringe at is when an organization may have an employee engagement survey, and they'll ask questions like, is my manager ethical? Or, does my organization act with integrity? And that's really hard, because that's such a conceptual question that's really hard to break it down into behavior. And so the best way that I've seen to create an ethical culture is to actually break down the specific behaviors that we really, the classic, do we want to start engaging in certain behaviors we don't do? Which behaviors do we have to stop doing, and which behaviors should we continue? And so it's really understanding that while there's certain themes that exist across the board, each culture and subculture is a bit unique, and it doesn't take long if you're willing to ask open questions, even if it's done internally as opposed to bringing in an outside party, of what are the things that we really don't do well here in terms of culture. And all that said, what I found is that almost always the root common denominator, or the root core of all of this, is the ability to speak up. I've yet to see an organization that has run into any issues with regards to ethics if people can ask questions. And so if you want to really start, what's the first step is to really be honest about whether or not people can ask questions in the organization. And if the answer is no, then that's where you start. You got to get to the root cause of what is it that causes people to not be able to ask questions.
Great, thank you, David. I have another one, and this is somewhat related. How do I start a conversation about self-awareness? Because we're so focused on compliance.
On compliance.
Yes.
So part of it is, it's a great question, but we can go in several different directions. One of the ways in which, if you want to start this conversation at an organizational level or even at a group level, part of it is even asking some of the provocative questions that we even talked about on this in this program together. You know, a lot of it is asking the question, just because we have rules, why do we think people will follow them if we know that's not the case in our outside world? And so part of it is really understanding how do we act as individuals. If it's a question of self-awareness versus compliance, again, it's really starting with some honest questions of what are circumstances in which compliance is followed slavishly, and where does it actually in denial of some basic human nature. So let me give you an example. Sometimes you know, we think of corporate compliance as just being a word that is, you know, represents the function of making sure people follow the rules. But being compliant is actually a pretty weak statement, right? We really don't want a culture of compliance. A lot of my clients will say, oh, I want to create a culture of compliance. And I push back saying, do you really want to create a culture where everybody is just mindless and they're just compliant with whatever they're told to do? You really want people to be thinking. And so I often will push back on them and say, culture of compliance, if it's following the good rules is great, but if it's following the bad rules is bad. Why don't you really want to focus on how do you create an environment of independent thinkers? And so therefore, it creates a little need of trust, but putting self-awareness on the agenda is fantastic. And it oftentimes will bring together leaders from leadership development and training development into the conversation that they have not been in before, because oftentimes corporate compliance is really locked into internal audit and legal, and they haven't really brought the human dimension to bear. So linking the human side with the rule side is a powerful conversation that unfortunately many organizations hasn't fully developed yet.
Thank you, David. Pamela, did you have any questions for David?
Well, I was curious, David, you know, when you're working with an organization or you have a champion that's not in a leadership position, how do you start this conversation? What's the conversation starter, especially along the lines, because I totally agree with you, of bridging the gap between what can be often separate departments of legal and compliance, and the areas that are actually have high touch points with individuals and leaders who can influence this from a self-awareness and accountability for impact standpoint. How do you help champion this within your organization?
Yeah, it certainly is hard, especially if there's a tendency in the organization to want to create institutional ownership of this issue. And just like looking at a broader culture issue, I mean, who owns culture? I mean, everybody owns it. So for individual leaders, even if they're mid-level managers who are trying to start it, a lot of it I find most helpful to focus on the business need for this and engage in conversations about the business benefit. And even if you're not at a level that you could talk about it at the broadest macro level, even talking about it for the dynamic of the team that you're in. So what I mean by that is if a mid-level manager has enough foresight that he or she wants to really focus on creating an ethical culture, well, it's not coming out of thin air. There's obviously a context that is generating that notion that we've got to do something different. And so even engaging in peer level discussions about what are the things that are challenging us can go a long way. So for example, how do you present it to your boss is maybe the next question. I've never met a leader who doesn't want to get bad news early. Every leader is fearful that if there is bad news, we may as well just get it out and we can deal with it. But they're fearful that people don't speak up and hold it. So if we're trying to kind of lead from where we are and help mid-level managers take ownership of this, I find it easier to talk about it in terms of getting people to speak up early before it becomes a problem, which is good for business, as opposed to trying to step on functional toes. So I would frame it for my boss to say, what do we need? I'm worried, boss, that if we're not going to meet our quota, our delivery, whatever it might be, people might not speak up because they're a little bit afraid. And I would like to take some action to help us be able to overcome that. Most leaders are going to be open to that conversation if it's being presented in that kind of open-ended way, as opposed to an accusatory, shut down, gee boss, you're a crook kind of way.
Great. Very helpful. David, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I think we could dive into the rabbit hole of neuroscience of this, the bias, the ethics, but my favorite part of what you've presented is really just bringing the conversation about humanity and how we navigate these stressful environments in a way that are in alignment with our values and the amount of work, consciousness, systems, and processes that are required to ensure that that is enabled. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It was fun. I think you're absolutely right. I think that more opportunity to just weave all these things together makes it a much stronger rope for sure. So thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, David. And I want to remind everyone that the next webinar will be on May 18th, and the topic will be communicated very soon. We're still cooking up an exciting new topic. So have a great rest of the day. And with that, we're signing off. Thanks, everyone.